There is a moment that most people don't talk about, not because it's rare, but because it's uncomfortable. It doesn't feel like awakening. It doesn't feel like clarity. It feels like something else, something heavier. A quiet realization that changes how you see everyone around you. It doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, subtle. At first, you just notice small things, the way people react, the way conversations repeat themselves, the same opinions, the same emotions, the same patterns, over and over again. And at first, you don't think much of it. You assume it's normal. You assume it's just how people are. But then, you start seeing it everywhere. In friends, in family, in strangers, even in yourself. A kind of automatic behavior, a loop, where people think they're choosing, but they're not. They're reacting, repeating, following something they don't even notice. And once you start seeing that, it becomes impossible to ignore, because now you're not just part of the interaction. You're observing it. You're watching it unfold, almost like you've stepped half a step back. And that's when the thought appears, quiet, uncomfortable, but persistent. What if they're not really aware of what they're doing? And that thought changes everything, because it's not just about one person. It's not just about a few situations. It's everywhere. And the more you see it, the harder it becomes to unsee it. You start noticing how predictable everything is, how people say the same things, react in the same ways, defend the same ideas without ever questioning them. And it creates a strange feeling, not superiority, not judgment, something else, distance, because now you're seeing the pattern while others are still inside it. And that creates a gap, a subtle separation, not because you want it, but because it's there. And this is where the realization becomes uncomfortable. Because the question is no longer, why are people like this? It becomes, how many of them are actually aware? And the deeper you go, the more unsettling it gets. Because you begin to see that most people are not choosing. They are being carried by habits, by reactions, by patterns they've never questioned. And from the outside, it looks like normal life. Everything functions, everything moves, everything continues, but underneath it, there is something mechanical, something repetitive, something almost programmed. And this is the moment no one prepares you for, the moment you realize you might be surrounded by people who are not fully awake. And the question that follows is the one that changes everything. If they don't see it, why do you? To understand this, you have to be careful, because it's very easy to misunderstand what you're seeing. This is not about intelligence. It's not about being smarter than others. It's not about knowing more, because what you're noticing has nothing to do with information. It has to do with awareness. And awareness is not evenly distributed. The Gnostic texts hinted at this in a very subtle way. They described a world where people believe they are conscious, but are actually moving within a structure they cannot see. Not controlled in an obvious way, not forced, but shaped, guided, influenced from within their own perception. They used words like Archons to describe this, but not as creatures in the sky, as forces, patterns, mechanisms that organize how reality appears, how thoughts form, how reactions happen, how meaning is created automatically. And once you start looking at it this way, something becomes clear. Most people are not choosing their thoughts. They are receiving them, repeating them, acting on them, without ever questioning where they came from. And this is not something you notice immediately, because from the inside, it feels like you're in control. It feels like you're thinking freely, deciding freely, acting freely. But if you slow down and observe closely, you begin to see something else. A thought appears instantly, without being invited, and almost immediately, it is believed, followed, turned into action. No gap, no space, just reaction. And this happens constantly, all day, every day, and for most people, it goes completely unnoticed because there is no distance from it. They are inside the process, not observing it, becoming it. And this is what creates the illusion of being awake. Because from within the loop, everything feels normal. Everything makes sense. Everything feels like me. But once you begin to see the process, you also begin to see how automatic it is, how repetitive, how predictable. And that's when the discomfort grows, because now you're not just seeing patterns in behavior, you're seeing patterns in awareness itself. You start to notice how people defend ideas without ever examining them, how they react emotionally before they even understand why, how they repeat beliefs that were never truly theirs to begin with. And it's not malicious, it's not intentional, it's unconscious. And that's what makes it so difficult to talk about. Because from their perspective, nothing is wrong. They feel awake, they feel aware, they feel like they are choosing just like you used to feel. And that's where the tension begins. Because now you're standing in two different positions at once. You remember what it felt like to be fully inside the loop. And at the same time, you're seeing it from the outside. And that creates a strange kind of isolation. Not because people are doing something wrong, but because you're no longer experiencing reality in the same way. And this is where many people make a mistake. They turn this realization into judgment. They start labeling others, calling them asleep, disconnected, unaware. But that reaction is just another pattern, another movement inside the same system. Because the moment you place yourself above others, you've already stepped back into the loop, just in a different form. And this is where the Gnostic perspective becomes extremely precise. It's not about who is awake and who is asleep. It's about seeing the mechanism itself, seeing how awareness becomes identified, how thoughts turn into identity, how patterns repeat without being questioned. And once you see that clearly, the focus changes. It's no longer about others. It becomes something much more direct, much more uncomfortable. If this is happening in them, how often is it still happening in you? Because the same mechanism you're observing is not exclusive to anyone else. It is the structure of perception itself. And that means you are not outside of it, not completely, not permanently. And that realization is where things begin to deepen. Because now the question is no longer, why are they asleep? It becomes, where am I still not seeing? At some point, if you stay with this long enough, something shifts. The focus moves. It stops being about what you see in others and starts becoming something much closer. Because once you recognize the pattern, you begin to catch it in yourself, not in theory, in real time. A thought appears, and for the first time, you notice how fast it takes over, how quickly it becomes you. There's no invitation, no decision. It just happens. And before you even realize it, you're already reacting, already thinking, already following it. And then, sometimes, there's a small interruption, a moment where you see it, where you catch the thought before it fully becomes action. And in that moment, something strange happens. There is a gap, a tiny distance between you and what's happening. And that gap changes everything, because now you're not completely inside the process. You're seeing it. And once you see it, you can't fully go back to not seeing it. But here's where it becomes difficult, because even when you see it, the pattern doesn't stop. The thought still appears. The reaction still tries to follow. The emotion still moves through you, and that creates confusion, because now you're aware, but not free. You see the mechanism, but you're still inside it. And the natural response is to try to control it, to stop it, to change it, to become more aware, to stay present, to fix the problem. But notice what's happening. That impulse to fix it is also part of the pattern. It's just more subtle, more refined. Instead of reacting unconsciously, you're reacting consciously. But it's still a reaction, still movement, still part of the same loop. And that's where most people get stuck, because now the system feels like growth. It feels like progress. It feels like you're evolving. But underneath it, the same structure remains. Thought appears. You respond. You try to adjust. You try to improve. And the cycle continues, just at a higher level. And if you watch closely, you can see how constant it is. There is almost no moment where something appears and is simply seen without being turned into action, without being used, without being followed. And that constant movement is what keeps everything in place. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're still participating, still feeding the loop. And then, occasionally, something different happens. A thought appears, and you don't follow it. Not because you're resisting, not because you're trying to stop it, but because you see it. And for a brief moment, you don't move. You don't react. You don't try to change it. You just notice it. And in that moment, there is no loop, no continuation, no reinforcement, just awareness. And that moment is so subtle that it's easy to miss, because nothing dramatic happens. No breakthrough, no explosion, no transformation, just stillness, just a pause. And for the mind, that can feel like nothing, like it doesn't matter, like it's not enough. So it quickly moves again, back into thinking, back into reacting, back into doing something. But if you stay with that moment, if you begin to notice it more often, something starts to become clear. The system is not maintained by what you don't see. It's maintained by what you do after you see. And that changes the entire perspective, because now you're not trying to wake up anymore. You're watching what keeps you from it in real time. And that is a very different position, because it's no longer about gaining something. It's about noticing something that is already happening over and over and over again. And the more clearly you see that, the harder it becomes to ignore. Because now, the question is no longer about others. It's not about who is asleep. It's not about who is aware. It's about this. What is happening in me right now that I'm not seeing? At this point, the question has completely changed. It's no longer about other people. It's no longer about who is awake and who isn't. Because if you've followed this far, you've already seen something important. The same mechanism you notice in others exists in you, not as a flaw, not as a mistake, but as part of how perception works. Thoughts appear, reactions follow, identity forms. And all of it happens automatically, without being questioned, and most of the time, without being seen. So the idea of being awake becomes more complicated because it's not a permanent state. It's not something you achieve once and keep forever. It's something much more fragile, something that appears and disappears, moment by moment, depending on whether you are seeing or reacting. And that changes everything, because now, awakening is not something you chase, it's something you notice when the usual movement stops, even briefly, even for a second, because in that moment, you are not being carried by the pattern. You're not being pulled into reaction. You are not becoming the thought. You are simply aware of it. And that is a completely different position, but it's also unstable, because the mind does not like stillness. It wants to move, to understand, to control, to turn everything into something. And as soon as that movement returns, the loop begins again, quietly, automatically, almost invisibly, which is why most people never question it. They assume they are awake because they are conscious, because they can think, because they can reflect. But thinking is not the same as seeing, and reflection is not the same as awareness. One is movement, the other is the absence of it. And that distinction is where everything begins to separate, because the system does not depend on you being unconscious. It depends on you being constantly engaged, constantly reacting, constantly moving from one thought to the next. And as long as that continues, the structure remains intact, not because it is forcing you, but because it is being maintained from within, through the way you relate to everything you experience. So the real shift is not in what you know, it's not in how much you understand, it's not in how many patterns you can see. It's in something much more subtle. What happens when you stop turning every moment into something you need to act on, when a thought appears and you don't immediately follow it, when a reaction arises and you don't become it, when something is seen and nothing is done, even for a moment, because in that moment, the loop is not being fed, the pattern is not being reinforced, and something else becomes visible, not as an idea, not as a concept, but as a direct experience that you are not the movement, you are what sees it. And that realization is not loud. It doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It doesn't feel like success. It feels almost like nothing. And that's why it's so easy to overlook. But once it's seen, even slightly, it changes the way you relate to everything. Because now, you don't need to escape the system. You begin to see how it operates. And more importantly, how it continues through you, through your reactions, through your constant engagement. And that is where the real question appears, not who is asleep, not who is awake, but something much more precise. What happens if I stop participating, even for a moment, not forever, not as a rule, just long enough to see what remains when the movement stops? Because if something in you recognizes this, even a little, then something has already shifted. Not because you did anything, but because you saw something clearly. And once something is seen clearly, it cannot be completely unseen. So maybe the moment you realized that others might still be asleep was never about them. Maybe it was the beginning of seeing how the same thing was happening in you right now. And the question is no longer, who is awake? It is, can I see, without immediately becoming what I see?